Tonight on the Fifth Estate. They call it shaken baby syndrome, and for decades the diagnosis was as good as a conviction.
They brought a doll in and wanted me to demonstrate how I shook her.
Thousands were convicted, families shattered, lives destroyed. But now there are doubts. Does the syndrome even exist?
There has been a terrible mistake, and the consequences of our getting this wrong is just so devastating for so many families.
Tonight, the battle that is rending the medical world, pitting a handful of questioning scientists against a powerful orthodoxy.
We don't want to believe that people will do this kind of thing to children, but I bury the children, and I'm here to tell you that people do it.
And questioning whether some of those convictions might have been wrong.
I lost everything. I lost my family, I lost my daughter, I lost my girlfriend, I lost everything. It just went right out the window and everything changed.
They were just teenagers when they started dating, still living at home with their parents. 6 months later, Jeff Smith and Natasha Scott discovered they were about to become parents themselves.
How do you plan to have children? Nobody plans to have children. It's just an accident. Like two teenagers not protected is the accident.
They weren't unhappy, but it was a difficult pregnancy. Natasha struggled to stay in school while Jeff worked to pay for the tiny apartment they'd found in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough. At 4.5 months, they learned Natasha was carrying not one baby, but 2. 6 weeks later, the twins arrived, a full 3 months premature.
Katie let out one little cry and then went blue, and they rushed her into a little incubator and cleaned her up a bit and put all these wires on her and needles into her and stuff like that. And it was kind of a scary situation to be in.
How big were they?
1.5 pounds. They sat actually in your palm of your hand. Once we got to Sick Kids Hospital, her little head sat there and her feet would come to about here.
The babies were so small, doctors weren't sure they'd survive and warned the parents to prepare for the worst. Jeff quit his job so he could spend more time at the hospital. He hadn't anticipated becoming a father at the age of 17, but his mother, Gloria, remembers he was a good one.
Oh, he adored them. He really did. He was such a happy daddy. He really loved them. You could see it in him, you know, when he would hold them and rock them, you know. And proud, he wanted to show them off to everybody.
It would be months before that could happen. Even in the hospital, Katie and her sister Kelly suffered bouts of respiratory distress, what the doctors called apnea. After 13 weeks, it appeared they'd stabilized. And having arranged for regular nurses' visits, Jeff and Natasha finally got the okay to take their babies home.
Oh, it was joy. It was fun. At least we had them, right? And it's finally we get to go home and be a family. It's nice, but the other hand, they were very sick. And one would crash, the other one would crash. One would crash, the other one would crash. And then
To stop breathing?
Yeah. And it was terrible. It was just terrible. And it was taking a toll on all of us.
Each crash sent them running back to the emergency ward. For the new parents, it was terrifying. But after so many visits, Gloria could see the hospital staff was getting frustrated.
I believe because they were so young, sometimes I don't think the hospitals took them seriously enough, which I thought was really wrong, because they've had some incidents where they've gone to the hospital and they've sent them home. They've called them like overzealous parents.
Then came the morning of March 21st. Katie in particular had had a rough night. Natasha had to go out, leaving Jeff home alone with the babies for the first time.
I made the balls come back and I went to pick Katie up. She went very limp on me. Like she was like our color, skin, breathing, just went limp.
As luck would have it, the health nurse was just arriving for her daily visit. It didn't take her long to realize something was seriously wrong.
It just happened so fast. She turned around and yelled to me, "Call 911." And then she started at CPR on the child. And then everybody showed up. Ambulance, fire, police, everybody. One of the drivers, the ambulance driver, said that she's pretty bad. He really wanted this child to go over and be airlifted or over to Sick Kids Hospital. That's kind of scared me, because then when he said no, okay, and I said, well, where are you bringing her? And he says, just to Scarborough General.
For 7 hours, Katie was watched in the Scarborough Hospital. By the time she finally did get transferred to Sick Kids in Toronto, it was too late. Katie was brain dead. The next day, her young parents had to make the painful decision to remove the life support.
It was sad. It hurt. For all the work that we've done and all the effort that I've done to try to save these children and bringing them back and forth, how many times I've gone to the hospital. It hurt. It hurt.
But for Jeff Smith, the loss of his young daughter was only the beginning in what was to become an 18-year horror story. In the days that followed, Katie's sudden death was scrutinized by the experts at Sick Kids. Pathologists found she died of a brain hemorrhage. There was also evidence her brain was swollen and that she was bleeding behind her eyes. In child abuse circles, they call it the triad, and then, as now, it usually points to one conclusion: abuse. Katie, the doctor said, had been shaken to death. As the last person caring for her, Jeff was now a murder suspect. Which immediately raised concerns for the safety of her twin. 3 days after losing Katie, Jeff was summoned back to Sick Kids Hospital and told to bring baby Kelly with him.
When I walked in, there was 2 officers, there was children's aid, and about 4 doctors, and I knew it wasn't good as soon as I seen everybody else standing there. So I had no choice but to hand the baby over, and it was terrible, just the way they did it.
One daughter dead, the other in protective custody. Within weeks, Jeff was charged with second-degree murder. According to the experts, the scientific evidence was overwhelming. At first, Natasha defended Jeff, but by the time the trial rolled around, she too had become a believer. Because back in the 1990s, everyone was.
Hundreds of babies die every year from a preventable health problem, shaken baby syndrome. University Hospital is trying to prevent such tragedies with an educational tool. Remember to never, never shake your baby. Never, ever, ever, ever shake your baby.
As horrible as it was to contemplate, the idea that someone could become so angry, so frustrated, they'd actually shake a child to death had gone mainstream.
Shut up!
It didn't matter that the syndrome was based on a hypothesis. The notion was powerful, and so were the doctors behind it. Pediatricians mostly, who established a national center in Utah, funding conferences and lobbying efforts, and offering prosecutors and police a well-financed resource center. Against all of that, defendants like Jeff Smith rarely stood a chance. He always denied shaking Katie and believed the courts would clear him. But it didn't happen.
19-year-old Jeffrey Smith seen talking to his lawyers here on Judgment Day, and the verdict, not guilty of second-degree murder, but guilty of manslaughter. The jury...
In 1996, he was sentenced to a 1.5 years in prison. For Natasha, who ended up testifying against him, it would never be long enough.
I think that he should have got more than 18 months.
Yeah.
18 months wasn't enough for the child's life that he took.
When we come back... Okay, here's the baby, John. What do I do?
Okay, so just shake the baby as violently as you can for as long as you can.
The science gets put to the test.
3, 2, 1.
The theory theory that shaking can kill took off in the 1980s. Today, shaken baby syndrome, or SBS, is so established, even TV doctors are quick with a simple diagnosis.
Yeah, we see it in the ERs, and when they come in, and parents they just lose their cool, and
it literally can take one shake, and a baby can suffer
serious brain damage. And this simulator can show you how that brain damage can happen. Okay, this baby starts to cry, and with a bit of forceful shaking, you can see the back of the brain starts to light up. That indicates this baby that's shaken like that will probably have visual problems, because this part of the brain controls vision. And as shaking continues, the front part of the brain lights up, and a baby there would have behavior problems, developmental problems, things like that.
For pediatricians especially, here was an explanation for some of the medical mysteries that until now science seemed unable to explain.
Shaking a baby is a violent action as a result of losing one's temper, which means losing control, losing reason, losing boundaries, and holding a baby and violently shaking them back and forth.
Dr. Robert Block heads the American Academy of Pediatrics and sits on the board of the National Center on Shaken Baby Syndrome.
So what is happening inside that child's body when that shaking, that violent shaking is going on?
Some of that's a little bit up for further resolution now, because you obviously can't shake a baby, and a real baby, and observe what's going on. But what's happening is that as the head is moving back and forth, it's also rotating, and rotational forces and acceleration, which means speeding up, and deceleration, which means stopping quickly. Those forces act on the brain to change its shape, which injures the nerve cells, injures blood vessels in the brain, injures the brain's ability to function as it normally should.
That's what the SBS believers think. But in laboratories around the world, including this one in Oxford, England, scientists are challenging the pediatrician's beliefs. Wayne Squire has spent 30 years studying children's brains and no longer believes shaking alone can cause the constellation of injuries that make up the syndrome.
I don't think we can be sure there's been shaking unless we have evidence to support it, and that would be, in my opinion, we would need to see damage to the neck, both to the spine or the back of the brain where it joins onto the spinal cord, or to the bones or the soft tissues in the neck, and probably bruises around the body and possibly fractured ribs where a parent had picked up a baby and shaken it hard enough to inflict this kind of injury, because you would have to shake pretty hard.
Have you ever seen that?
I've never seen anything that I'm sure is due to shaking, no.
Which brings us back to Jeff Smith. When he went to trial in 1996, there was no evidence that his baby daughter Katie had suffered neck damage, fractures, or bruises. And yet the experts insisted he had shaken her. According to his lawyer, David Bayless, the testimony revolved around the brain hemorrhages she and her twin sister Kelly both had.
There were previous bleeds in both of the twins' heads documented in their medical records. So the evidence of prior bleeds, from our perspective, was consistent with some sort of a medical condition that was recurring.
Wayne Squire thinks that's entirely possible. Her research tells her that brain hemorrhages have many potential causes, including infections and the trauma that often comes with just being born.
Nearly half of all newborn babies have bleeding around the brain, and I think we are not recognizing the frequency with which an old bleed is still underlying the cause of collapse in these babies. And I think, talking to colleagues, that I would imagine that something like 75 or 80% of shaken baby syndrome involves a chronic subdural hemorrhage, an old bleed that's been lingering around the brain and hasn't gone away.
But what about the evidence of bleeding behind Katie's eyes? Retinal hemorrhaging, along with brain swelling, are the two other pillars of the SBS syndrome. On the stand, the consulting ophthalmologist was categorical.
I mean, his position was that regardless of anything else, even if there were no other injuries, even if there was no bleeding, nothing, the very fact that she had these particular hemorrhages in her eyes meant that she had been shaken.
Where you actually see the hemorrhages is not here, but it's...
Forensic pathologist Pat Lance has been looking to validate the SBS theory for years, but he hasn't been able to. In 2004, he started examining the eyes of every cadaver he autopsied. In 2 years, more than 1,000 pairs of eyes. What he found is that no matter what the cause of death, 1 out of 7 showed evidence of retinal bleeding.
And they may be associated with infections, inflammation of the brain, or in cases of trauma where there's no suspicion of abuse whatsoever. Most forensic pathologists, medical examiners don't examine eyes unless abuse was suspected. If you are only looking for retinal hemorrhages to find abuse, and then you see retinal hemorrhages, and then you call it abuse, it's circular reasoning.
Circular it may be, but for years it was unchallenged in the medical world. Those who tried dismissed as fringe. But like fringes everywhere, they've found a community and host their own anti-SBS conferences, like this one in BC this summer.
We are there to defend what we believe, and it's a rare person that can step outside him or herself and objectively look at the evidence.
Like most medical practitioners, John Plunkett, a forensic pathologist from Minnesota, started out an SBS believer. That's what he was taught. And this syndrome is still taught in virtually every medical school in the world. For Plunkett, that's a big part of the problem.
And I think the natural tendency is, in a student-teacher relationship, to believe what your teacher has told you. And I think that's what's happened here. And you need some pretty powerful incentives to show you that this may have been wrong.
Plunkett's incentives came when he started reading beyond the medical literature and delved into the world of biomechanics. It's where everything we know about safety comes from airbags in cars to bike helmets for kids. According to SBS believers, this is what happens when a baby is shaken. What's called the brain's bridging veins rip apart, causing the hemorrhaging and swelling that are part of the syndrome. But when biomechanical engineer Chris Van E tried to model the kind of force that would be necessary to damage bridging veins, he couldn't do it.
The scenario where you shake and produce these angular accelerations that produce this injury in the brain without producing injury anywhere else, that isn't biomechanically valid. That's been shown by my own work as well as others, that you can't generate the angular accelerations associated with bridging vein rupture.
In Jeff Smith's trial, one of the experts testified that baby Katie died from what must have been massive shaking that would have lasted at least 5 minutes and generated a force equivalent to a child flying through the air at 80 miles an hour and striking a tree. Was that even possible? We decided to see. Biomechanical engineer John Lloyd hooked us up with the equipment and the crash test dummy.
Okay, here's the baby, John. What do I do?
Okay, so just shake the baby as violently as you can for as long as you can. Ready?
If I was really angry, right?
Start. 3, 2, 1, begin.
Oh my goodness.
Harder than that. Keep going, keep going.
How many seconds is that?
About 8 seconds. 10 seconds.
I can't do it more than that. That's too heavy. Wow.
And that's what research shows.
Wow. So show me what we did here then.
This is the data after we've calculated the accelerations, the angular accelerations. And the maximum value I'm seeing is about 1200 radians per second squared in terms of angular acceleration. Let me give that to you in meaningful terms. It's about 12% of the actual angular acceleration that would be required to cause brain injury in an infant.
12%?
Only 12%.
I didn't even come anywhere
Didn't come close.
But does that mean no one can do it? We went back to the lab.
I'm not the biggest and strongest person in the world, but is it possible that somebody stronger than me can generate more force?
It's possible. Let me give it a try.
Gonna try? Okay.
Okay, ready?
In the biomechanical experiments, even the biggest college football players couldn't shake hard enough to do damage. John Lloyd is a former rugby player.
And that's about it.
Let's see, what did you do here?
All right, so this is the analyzed data from my event of shaking the infant mannequin, and I was able to generate only a hair more angular acceleration than you were, maybe about 1250 radians per second squared, so we're in the same ballpark.
Chris Van E was not surprised.
The anatomy is different in both structure and composition.
It is possible, in theory, he says, to shake a child to death, but
if you have a child with a brain injury with no other sign of impact or abuse on them whatsoever, with a subdural hematoma, I just don't think that shaking was the thing that produced rotational accelerations to rip a bridging vein. That just doesn't seem to follow.
now that kind of biomechanical work was still in its infancy when Jeff Smith went to trial. His lawyer tried to introduce evidence that questioned the SBS hypothesis, but he was outgunned. He had 2 expert witnesses. The Crown had 9, some of whom made it quite clear that, science aside, Jeff was just the kind of parent to lose it.
The evidence was to the effect that basically certain types of people shake babies. And the types of people who shake babies are parents who are inexperienced, parents who might have stresses in their lives such as poverty, parents who might have stresses in their lives such as sick babies. So ironically, the stress that Natasha and Jeff had with their children, which was largely trying to keep them healthy, constantly taken to the hospital because they thought they'd stop breathing from these apnea attacks, those stresses became evidence that one of them had shaken the baby. It was very Kafkaesque.
When we come back, the SBS juggernaut rolls on.
They were hollering and hollering, and I couldn't take it anymore. I started vomit. My body started to seize, and they had to call an ambulance for me.
And the victims aren't just parents.
You've been told that you shouldn't talk about this for the time being.
Yes.
And you take that seriously.
I do, yes. Yes, my whole profession, my ability to work, hangs in the balance.
There are no reliable statistics in this country for how many babies get diagnosed with SBS or how many parents and caregivers get charged. In the United States, they estimate as many as 200 people a year are convicted. But for parents, it doesn't take a jail sentence to do life-altering damage. Zabeth and Paul Baines of Surrey, BC, had never heard of SBS until September 2007, when their son, a toddler, tripped over his baby sister, banging her head into the floor.
I can't surmise how fast he was falling on her or anything. I just know, how much he weighed and where he was coming and how he was running.
Were you concerned after you'd seen this happen?
Heavens, yes. Oh, heavens, yes. But I was surprised, too, that she was only whimpering. You know, like I thought that after that she would have been screaming.
They went to the emergency ward anyway, and after 2 weeks of getting no answers at local hospitals, ended up at the Children's Hospital in Vancouver. By that time, the baby's symptoms, a brain bleed and retinal hemorrhage, were clear. Soon, too, was a pediatrician's diagnosis.
She has shaken baby syndrome.
Yeah, she's been shaken.
And
she's been shaken.
I felt like I didn't know. I hadn't heard of this.
You sat there in shock.
We're parents of 2 other children, but I actually haven't heard of shaken baby syndrome before. But it wasn't good.
Well, so she comes and says, I've concluded that this baby was shaken.
Yeah.
And you said, presumably, well, hang on just a second, there was this impact, this incident that happened a few weeks ago. And what did she say to that?
Shook her head.
She hung her head a lot and just shook her head.
Yeah.
Looked like that.
There's no talking to her at all.
No talking and no stopping what happened next. protocol demanded Child Protective Services be called. The Baines children were taken into custody. As for Paul and Zabeth, they were now suspected child abusers. The police interrogation was brutal.
They brought a doll in and wanted me to demonstrate how I shook her, which obviously I couldn't do. I didn't shake her. And they were hollering and hollering, and I couldn't take it anymore. I started to vomit. My body started to seize, and they had to call an ambulance for me.
And then trying to pit us against each other. They said, oh, you know, your wife told us that you did it. She admitted to it. And then said the same thing to her. And I'm like, no, she didn't.
No.
I know better than that.
The police eventually closed the criminal case for lack of evidence, and soon their baby daughter was well enough to go home. But the Baines were never allowed to take her. The children remained in protective custody and were eventually placed in foster homes.
Your heart's been ripped out.
You just die.
Yeah.
It's your living. You have to breathe and eat and get up in the morning, but you don't sleep, you don't eat, you just cry.
There is no overstating the impact of the words child abuser, especially in a prison. In 1996, having been convicted of shaking his daughter to death, Jeff Smith started an 18-month sentence.
I lost everything. I lost my family, I lost my daughter, I lost my girlfriend, I lost everything. My self-esteem, like everything, it's just gone. They took it away. My childhood and everything is just went right out the window, and everything changed.
Among the many things 19-year-old Jeff had to learn was how to survive inside as a baby killer.
I've gotten hit, I've gotten to the hospital, and I've been pushed off ranges, and I guess it could have been worse. They could have killed me in there. They definitely wanted me off the range.
You know, I can't help but feel responsible. I did the best I could during the trial, but I often say to myself, maybe if I'd done something differently, the result might have been different.
There were appeals, but they went nowhere. Still, lawyer David Bayless stayed in touch with Jeff, always believing he'd been wrongly convicted.
So it's the kind of thing you think about constantly, and I would certainly like to see the day when that's corrected.
Among the things that convinces Bayless is the fact that Katie's twin sister Kelly suffered the same kind of brain bleeds and continued to suffer them, even after she was taken away from her parents.
I think that was a significant factor in our shock at the verdict. I mean, we thought it was pretty powerful to say, look, the Crown is saying that this has to come from shaking, and yet you know that the surviving twin continued to have subdural bleeding after she was removed from the family. But you know, it was all part of the culture of that time. I mean, there was a parade of witnesses saying that Katie had been shaken.
A parade of witnesses that Bayless couldn't counteract. Back in 1996, scientists were starting to question SBS, but few were prepared to testify.
I probably spoke to 50 or 60 people all over North America, many of whom expressed very serious reservations about the diagnosis that was being made with respect to Katie's death, but very few of them. In fact, I was only able to convince 2 of them to come to court and say that because they felt that there was more or less a blackballing that might happen if they were to take a stance against this sort of prevailing culture.
15 years later, that hasn't changed. Weenie Squire is one of Britain's preeminent pediatric pathologists, but her position on SBS has made her a target. Last summer, a well-known SBS believer filed what she claims are bogus professional charges against her that could cost her her medical license. Lawyers have warned her about speaking out, even about doing this interview.
Do you think it's accidental or coincidental that these kinds of charges are being made against you?
No, I don't think so. I think that this has been a coordinated campaign, but I think at the moment it's probably best that we don't go into any detail about my feelings about that.
You've been told that you shouldn't talk about this for the time being?
Yes.
And you take that seriously?
I do, yes. Yes, my whole profession, my ability to work, hangs in the balance.
But Dr. Robert Block has little sympathy. He just doesn't believe what Squire and the others are trying to show. The only real science, he says, is what pediatricians and child abuse experts have been relying on all along.
We would tell you that there are hundreds and hundreds of people who agree to that science. So if you have, make up a number, 300-400 people who agree to the science and one person who doesn't, does that really mean that there's a controversy? Does that really mean that there's new science? It's not my job to prove that they're wrong because I already don't believe that they're correct. They have to prove to me and the rest of the world that what they're saying is true.
You know, this could be easily a very interesting academic debate if it weren't for the fact that this affects people's lives. Over the last number of decades and even today, people are going to jail. They are being convicted because their child has been diagnosed with shaken baby syndrome, and often that is a diagnosis of murder. Do you ever ask yourself, do you ever question whether or not mistakes have been made?
I have yet to find a reporter, including you, who comes to me and says, Dr. Block, what about the babies who are killed? What about the babies who are neurologically impaired forever? Why do they not count? Why is the only person we're concerned about the person who might have been innocent who went to jail?
Back in BC, the Bains escaped jail, but still lost their family, including a new baby born last year. Even before Zabeth was out of the delivery room, child protection workers arrived to take him away too.
So you lost another baby?
Yeah. And that was even harder just because he was newborn.
We felt so helpless. Totally helpless.
Yeah.
This whole thing, we felt helpless. Every right has been taken away for a mommy and a daddy. Your right to protect your children from the bad stuff in the world, your right to provide for them, your right to care for them. It's all stripped away.
The Bains launched a court case against the BC government to get their family back, but in the meantime their children remained in foster care, and Paul, who used to work in sales, and Zabeth, who taught piano, had big changes to make.
What did you do?
Became janitors. Work at night. Clean toilets and wash windows at night so we could be free for our children in the daytime when they have visits and stuff. So we adapted.
Quite a change.
Yeah, we adapted.
Not what you thought life was going to be.
No.
No.
When we come back, the tide begins to change and convictions get re-examined.
To me, this is clearly an infant who died as a result of natural causes. The bottom line, natural causes.
Years after he was convicted of shaking his infant daughter to death, Jeff Smith still lives with the consequences. He works, but only sporadically, and only in jobs that don't require a criminal record search. No one wants to hire a baby killer. But last year, something happened to give him hope. In light of evolving science, the Ontario government struck a panel of experts to review SBS convictions. 4 cases were recommended for judicial review. One of them was Jeff's.
What did you think when you heard that?
I was so relieved. I was so happy. It was just, I don't know what to say. Speechless. At least somebody that's being heard and being talked of, right? I always knew that I never did nothing to these children.
Today, Jeff has big guns in his corner. James Lockyer and his association in the defense of the wrongly convicted have a long history of success.
My experience, I've now been probably through more than a dozen of these. My experience is that in each and every case, you have a natural cause of death beckoning you. And yet that natural cause of death is overridden or overrode by flawed pathology, and I've no doubt this is one of those cases. and then the Court of Appeal process.
In preparing Jeff's case, Lockyer sought out SBS skeptics to review the testimony. Among the things they discovered was that the bleeding identified in Katie's brain wasn't even associated with the syndrome. Forensic pathologist John Plunkett.
To me, this is clearly an infant who died as a result of natural causes. The bottom line, natural causes. She had no evidence for any external injuries whatsoever, and she had bleeding within the ventricles themselves. That type of bleeding is due almost exclusively to lack of oxygen. It's the type of bleeding that is associated with prematurity.
But not even a judicial review has diminished the certainty of the believers.
Because human nature is what it is, I suspect, we don't want to believe that people will do this kind of thing to children. So we're always looking for reasons to prove that they didn't do it. But I bury the children, and I'm here to tell you that people do it.
They also, he points out, sometimes confess to doing it.
Here's the baby with subdural hemorrhages, maybe a rib fracture, maybe not, retinal hemorrhages in a certain pattern, brain injury that we can see, and they tell us, here's what I did. Now, how in the world can you just forget about all of that because somebody has an alternative hypothesis? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so I've seen some of those confessions. I've been directly involved in 2 cases where people pleaded guilty. I mean, that's the ultimate confession.
And in both of those cases, the convictions were overturned.
In the shaken baby cases, they're the cases where you find that the police will exert the most pressure on the individual. They will cajole them, they will persuade them, they will tell them that they know they didn't really mean to hurt the baby, and they will spend hours and hours battering them because the police are so horrified at the crime that they believe has taken place.
You've called this a scandal. How big a scandal is it? What are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about really an international scandal. This is not exclusive to Canada by any stretch of the imagination. I suspect that we've probably been more careful with it than many countries. Certainly now, the courts are beginning to look at it more quizzically, but not nearly quizzically enough in my view.
It took 4 years, but eventually the courts in BC found Zabeth and Paul Baines had not shaken their baby either. They were cleared of abuse allegations, and their children finally returned home. But that doesn't mean the anxiety is over.
Well, we can never work around children again. I can never be a coach of a soccer team or something because they'll do a background check on me and they'll find out that I have a history, quote unquote.
Even though you were never charged, you were absolved of what
Just in case. Just in case.
As for the children, they fear the scars will never heal.
They need a lot of reassurance that, they're going to be home forever.
Or accidents happening.
Yeah, the children have a fear of accidents. They play too hard, If they get a bruise, even in gym or something, they'll show you and they'll be like, is someone going to take us again? I got a bruise.
It's those kinds of desperate stories that flood Wayne Squire's inbox, even in England, and despite the warnings, keep her speaking out.
There has been a terrible mistake, and the consequences of our getting this wrong is just so devastating for so many families that I feel that I have to do my best to try and get the science out there and to get people to understand that there is another explanation.
As for Jeff Smith, exoneration, if it comes, will be sweet, but not curative. He's lost too much for that. A decade and a half ago, he and Natasha had been starting to build a family, a home, a future. To this day, they do not speak.
That's one of the problems with a wrongful conviction. The stigma always stays there. And Natasha may well never be convinced. And she might well have people telling her, even after Jeff is exonerated, that he's not really innocent.
I'll always remember what she's done to me, but I forgive her. She had to get her daughter back. At least she went home to mommy. So I can't always hold a grudge and hate everybody. I got enough doctors to hate. So there's enough sadness in my life already. I don't need it.
All these years later, he still makes regular visits to Katie's grave. But the emotions are always double. Her twin sister, Kelly, just turned 18, and yet since that day she was taken from him in the hospital, Jeff has never been allowed to see her.
You hope that at some point, when she's an adult, that you are able to establish some kind of a relationship with her?
I would love to. Yeah, it would be great.
What would you tell her about all of this, if you could?
I love her. I miss her. And hopefully she comes and visits with me. Maybe even stays with me. It'd be lovely.
We did ask Natasha and Jeff's daughter Kelly to participate in our documentary. They chose not to comment. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.